It started with a scream, sharp and shrill enough to make birds scatter from nearby trees and draw the attention of every person enjoying a calm Saturday morning in Rose Hill Meadows, a picturesque gated community known for its manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, an increasingly notorious HOA president named Karen Albridge. You're tired of Karen's weaponizing authority, meddling in people's lives and getting away with it. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to witness is a neighborhood drama that spiraled into a legal storm, a security guard revolt, and a fight that shook the HOA to its entitled core. Karen, with her perfectly pressed pantsuit, an ever-present clipboard, is marching across the community center parking lot like a general inspecting troops, barking orders into her walkie-talkie while simultaneously dialing the HOA urgency line she had pushed to implement just weeks earlier. Security breach, she spat into the receiver, glaring at Carlos Ramirez, the new head of security who had been hired barely a month ago to replace the retiring Harold Jenkins. Carlos, a former Marine and private security consultant, had taken the job thinking it would be easy smiling at residents, doing patrols, and occasionally telling kids to stop skateboarding in the common areas. He hadn't anticipated that his biggest threat wouldn't be criminals, but the HOA president herself, who seemed determined to treat him like a personal servant rather than a trained professional. That morning, the fight began over a seemingly minor issue. Karen spotted a delivery van parked in the resident-only area and demanded Carlos's issue a violation ticket. Carlos, having already cleared the delivery earlier with the homeowner and double-checked their visitor log, politely declined, explaining that the van was within the rules. Karen's face twisted into something almost inhuman rage, disbelief, and entitlement contorted her features as she screeched, "I am the president of this HOA, and you will do as I say." Carlos stayed calm, standing tall with his arms crossed, not budging. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I follow the HOA charter, not personal orders. And the charter says, 'Don't you quote the charter to me?'" she shrieked, jabbing her manicured finger toward his chest. "You're here to serve this community, and I represent the community." A small crowd had gathered by this. Point residents out walking dogs or sipping their morning coffee were now quietly watching the standoff. Many had witnessed Karen's wrath before, but few had ever seen someone stand up to her so directly. Her voice rising and arms flailing, she turned the confrontation physical, swatting at Carlos's radio and shouting for his badge. "You're fired! Fired! Give me your keys and get out!" she yelled. Carlos refused, calmly stating that only the property management company or the HOA board could terminate his employment, not her, not unilaterally. The fury on Karen's face was nuclear. She grabbed at his shirt, shouting that he was a disgrace to security and a liability to the community, all while Carlos stepped back to avoid further escalation. Then she made the fatal mistake. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, calling the police and claiming she was being threatened by an armed guard. That was the moment the whole neighborhood took out their phones and began filming. Within minutes, squad cars pulled into the parking lot, sirens blaring. Two officers got out and immediately approached Carlos, who had his hands in the air and was already holding his security ID out. "He has a weapon," Karen yelled, pointing at Carlos's standard issue, holstered sidearm, which he was legally authorized to carry on the premises. The officers, tense but measured, asked Karen to step back while they assessed the situation. A neighbor, Mrs. Daly, who had filmed the entire thing from her second-story balcony, marched up and told the cops point-blank that Karen had instigated everything. "She's been harassing him for weeks," Mrs. Daly said. She didn't like that he said no to her for once. Karen, now visibly shaken that her plan was unraveling, tried to change her story, claiming she only felt unsafe and that Carlos had given her a threatening look. The officers, now reviewing multiple resident videos, saw clearly that Carlos had done nothing wrong. After 15 agonizing minutes, the officers apologized to Carlos and issued Karen a formal warning for filing a false report. Her mouth hung open in disbelief. "But I'm the president," she said again, as if those words held magical power. "Not anymore, maybe," someone in the crowd muttered. What the residents didn't know yet was that this wasn't just a bad morning. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would uncover corruption, secrets, and a neighborhood coup that would force everyone to choose sides. Karen wasn't done, and neither was Carlos. In the days that followed, Karen stormed into the next HOA meeting with a vengeance, holding up printed screenshots of her favorite portions of the bylaws, slamming them onto the table in front of the board. "This man is a threat," she claimed, "and you're all enabling him." The board, it's made up of 5 individuals, 2 of whom had also been victims of Karen's power plays, tried to remain neutral, reminding her that she had no legal authority to fire security or enforce rules unilaterally. One board member, Ted Morrison, even suggested that an external mediator be brought in, a move that made Karen seethe with fury. Carlos, meanwhile, remained professional, submitting his own report of the incident and attaching statements from 7 different witnesses. But he also began noticing things, small, strange things. His patrol logs were being altered. Resident complaints with his name on them started appearing, most of them obviously fake. One even claimed he'd let a teenager joyride a golf cart through the pool area, a charge he disproved with timestamped surveillance footage. Someone was trying to build a case against him. At first, he thought it might be Karen acting alone. But then, he found an internal memo slipped under the security office door and signed, but with HOA letterhead saying his attitude and insubordination were being reviewed. Carlos wasn't rattled. He'd faced worse threats in the field. But what concerned him was that someone inside the HOA was backing Karen's mission to get rid of him. That's when he started recording everything. Body cam footage, audio logs, even printing out timestamps and screenshots of emails. If they wanted a war, he was going to bring documentation to a knife fight. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior only escalated. She began patrolling the neighborhood on her own golf cart, clipboard in hand, stopping at homes to issue warnings over lawn length, garbage bins, left out an hour too long, and even accusing a teenager of loitering at the community park because he was sitting under a tree with a book. Residents began whispering. Private Facebook groups were flooded with videos, memes, and discussions. "Karen is out of control," one post read. "She's going after Carlos because she can't control him." Others shared footage from the parking lot incident, now going semi-viral in neighborhood circles. Some began organizing a quiet resistance, forming among homeowners who had long gritted their teeth through Karen's reign of terror but never had a rallying point. Carlos, unintentionally, became that rallying point. He hadn't asked for it, but he represented the first person to say no and not fold. And now, behind closed doors and text threads, residents were talking about recall elections, audits, and wadits, and even legal steps. One homeowner, Angela Thompson, was a retired paralegal. She began researching the HOA's voting procedures and gathering signatures to request a special meeting. Another, Joe McMillan, had a friend who worked at a local news outlet and hinted that the story might have legs beyond the neighborhood. Tensions were mounting. The streets of Rose Hill Meadows remained as quiet and beautiful as ever, but underneath that polished surface, a powder keg was forming. One misstep, one spark, and everything would explode. And Karen, sensing the walls closing in, wasn't going to go down quietly. She had one more move up her sleeve, something that would turn Carlos's world upside down and test his limits in ways even war never did. The fight was only beginning, and by the end of it, someone would be forced out of the community. 3 days after the incident in the parking lot, a thick envelope was delivered to Carlos's security office. Dropped off by a man in a brown jacket who didn't say a word and left before Carlos could even ask who sent it. The envelope was unmarked, except for his name scrawled across it in capital letters with a black marker. Inside was a stack of printed documents, grainy black and white photos, and a typed letter with no signature. The letter alleged Carlos had falsified portions of his military discharge papers. His license for armed security was under review, and that he had been investigated for an altercation at his last job in another community. Carlos read it all twice, eyes narrowing, the tension in his jaw pulsing. Every single allegation was false. He knew it, and the people who hired him had thoroughly vetted him. But the tone of the letter wasn't meant to seek the truth, was meant to scare. It was psychological warfare. Karen had clearly found someone with access to private records, or someone willing to fabricate them. And now she was escalating things far beyond HOA rules and parking lot disputes. He took the packet to his supervisor at Silver Rock Security Services, who verified his licensing was fully active and that no formal complaints had ever been filed with the company. They agreed to assign an internal investigator to look into the origin of the documents, but Carlos could already see the cracks forming. "Keep your head down for a while," his supervisor warned. "This HOA sounds toxic. You don't need to get tangled in their personal wars." But Carlos wasn't backing down. Not after being humiliated. Not after being accused of threatening a woman. And not after the community had started quietly thanking him for standing up. That same evening, as Carlos drove his patrol golf cart down Fairview Drive, he noticed Karen parked on the side of the road in her luxury SUV, lights off, engine running. She was watching him. Their eyes met for a moment as he passed, her expression unreadable, but it sent a shiver down his spine. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was planning. That night, someone slashed the tires of his personal car in the parking lot behind the community clubhouse. The vandalism was reported, police took a statement, and Carlos filed a report, but no cameras caught it. The HOA security system conveniently had technical difficulties that evening. Carlos, growing more suspicious, started keeping a body camera rolling at all times and made copies of his daily reports, storing them off-site. He wasn't going to be blindsided. Meanwhile, inside the HOA board, friction was bubbling. Board member Ted Morrison called an emergency meeting to discuss Karen's conduct, and 3 of the 5 members attended. Karen arrived late, stormed into the conference room with a file in hand, and accused Carlos of creating a hostile atmosphere. She claimed she had received anonymous complaints from female residents who said Carlos stared too long, and that his presence made them feel unsafe. Ted interrupted, demanding proof of these accusations. Karen refused to name names, citing resident privacy, but her story wavered under pressure. One board member, Janice Rowley, said she had spoken personally with over a dozen residents who supported Carlos and wanted him to stay. Karen, red-faced and defensive, turned the conversation into a shouting match until the meeting was adjourned with no resolution. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, she issued an HOA-wide email blast under the title Community Safety Concerns, filled with veiled language clearly directed at Carlos. She mentioned armed personnel exceeding their boundaries, unapproved surveillance equipment, and a need to revisit HOA authority protocols. The email triggered mixed reactions. Some residents responded in defense of Carlos, while others began questioning what was really going on. The tension was growing unbearable. That weekend, things came to a head during the monthly community cleanup event. Dozens of residents were scattered across the neighborhood picking up trash, planting flowers, and repainting benches. Carlos was helping a group of teenagers refill mulch around the park trees when Karen arrived in her branded golf cart, flanked by 2 recently recruited volunteers, both older men who seemed suspiciously eager to follow her lead. Karen marched up to Carlos, this time with a clipboard, a new rule she had written herself that supposedly barred security guards from participating in resident-led events due to conflict of interest. Carlos, puzzled and annoyed, asked her what authority she had to write and implement new rules without board approval. "I am the elected president," she snapped, "and I will not have you interfering in resident activities." The argument escalated rapidly. Parents began pulling their kids away. Cell phones came out again. One of Karen's so-called assistants stepped forward and physically tried to pull Carlos away from the mulch pile, which triggered an immediate response. Stepped back and warned the man not to touch him again. The man responded by lunging at Carlos, who sidestepped, causing the man to trip over a bag of mulch and fall into the dirt. Karen screamed for someone to call the police, claiming Carlos had attacked a volunteer. Within 10 minutes, another round of police officers arrived. This time, Carlos stood calm, let his body cam footage play on the officer's screen, and showed them how he had been grabbed first. Multiple residents supported him, including a teenage girl who had filmed the whole thing on her phone. The man who lunged was issued a citation for disorderly conduct. Karen looked like she might explode. Her face was pale, her eyes wild, and her voice trembled with fury as she yelled at the officers, calling them useless and corrupt. "You're all in on it," she shrieked. "This man is dangerous and nobody's doing anything."
The officers
Asked her to calm down or face being removed from the public space. She stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. It was the moment residents began realizing the extent of her unraveling. That night, the private Facebook group for Rose Hill Meadows lit up with comments, photos, and videos. "Enough is enough," wrote one resident. "She's abusing her power, harassing staff, and now trying to hurt people's reputations." Angela Thompson, the retired paralegal, posted a poll about initiating a recall election. It passed with overwhelming support. Carlos, while appreciative of the outpouring of support, knew this wasn't over. Karen still had allies, still had her hands in the administrative files, and clearly had someone helping her forge or twist documentation. He called his old military friend Marcus, who now worked as a private investigator. "I need help," Carlos said. "Someone's going too far." Marcus agreed to come visit the following week and dig into Karen's background. Meanwhile, Carlos was handed another letter, this one official. It was a notice of pending review from the HOA's third-party property management firm, informing him that a formal complaint had been filed about his behavior and that his role was under internal review. Carlos laughed bitterly as he read it. The complaint had Karen's fingerprints all over it. She was escalating the war through bureaucracy now, trying to bury him in red tape while she maintained a grip on her throne. But what she didn't know was that Carlos had already begun quietly documenting everything. From audio recordings of private HOA conversations to proof that Karen had authorized spending from the HOA budget without board approval, he had even uncovered one troubling paper trail where a vendor had been paid twice for a landscaping job. Both checks signed electronically by Karen. It looked like misappropriation of funds, maybe even fraud. He was collecting pieces of a much bigger puzzle, and he suspected this whole vendetta wasn't just personal, it was also about hiding something. Karen's obsession with control was more than ego, it was desperation. Something about Carlos's presence, his refusal to be bullied, had rattled her deeper than anyone else before him. And the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous she became. What neither of them knew was that the next incident wouldn't involve words or emails or even staged complaints. The next escalation would involve a full-blown physical confrontation, caught on camera, that would send shockwaves through the entire HOA board and get the media involved. And when it happened, there would be no going back. It happened on a blistering Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the sun scorched the pavement and even the birds seemed too exhausted to chirp. Most residents had retreated indoors to air-conditioned comfort, but Karen was on the prowl again. Golf cart loaded with flyers, yardsticks, and her new favorite weapon, HOA citation slips printed with bold red borders that screamed violation. She had already issued 3 warnings that morning, one for a garden gnome she deemed offensive, another for a garage door that hadn't been repainted in exact HOA-compliant beige, a third to an elderly couple for a bird bath, attracting undesirable wildlife. But she wasn't just harassing residents any. Morcarin had made Carlos her full-time obsession. Ever since the community cleanup debacle and the failed attempt to pin an assault on him, she had doubled down, operating like a shadow government. Now, instead of confrontation, she had switched tactics to surveillance. Unbeknownst to most residents, Karen had installed 2 high-resolution motion-activated cameras in shrubbery near the clubhouse and community garden, hoping to catch Carlos misconducting himself. But the cameras were illegal, no signage, no notice, and placed on HOA property without approval. What she hadn't anticipated was that Carlos had already suspected something. With Marcus, the former military friend turned private investigator in town and helping him sweep the area. It didn't take long before they discovered one camera tucked inside a decorative planter and another hidden behind a fake electrical box near the pool entrance. Marcus dismantled both quietly and photographed them before removing the SD cards. When they reviewed the footage later that night, they weren't surprised to find mostly empty lawns, some children playing, and Carlos going about as normal. Patrols, but Then there was footage of Karen herself, installing the devices under the cover of darkness. Her face clearly visible, her clipboard in one hand and a roll of duct tape in the other. She had not only broken HOA rules, but likely state privacy laws too. "This is more than harassment now," Marcus said, frowning as he watched the footage loop again. "This is obsession, and it's illegal." Carlos nodded but said nothing. He was beyond stunned. He felt violated. He thought back to all the strange moments in the past week, the odd glances from residents, the sudden spread of false rumors, and now he understood why. Karen wasn't just trying to get him fired. She was trying to destroy his character, to paint him as unstable, dangerous, unfit. She was playing the long game, so he decided to play his own. Carlos emailed the footage of Karen installing the illegal cameras directly to the entire HOA board. CCing the property management firm and attaching a brief but firm statement outlining his intention to file an official complaint. The board was silent for nearly 24 hours. And then an emergency meeting was called private, no residents invited. But Karen wasn't about to sit quietly. She beat them to the punch by showing up the next day in full force at the community fitness center ribbon-cutting ceremony, where local press had been invited to cover the newly installed gym equipment and walking trail. She had planned the event herself as a PR stunt to distract from the mounting backlash. Residents gathered, many unaware of the brewing storm behind the scenes. Karen took the microphone, smiling with calculated warmth, and began thanking donors, praising the HOA's excellent leadership, and even slipping in a reference to untrustworthy personnel being removed for the safety of all. Carlos stood quietly near the edge of the gathering, wearing his security badge and uniform, stoic and composed. Then Karen dropped the bomb. "Today we begin a new chapter in Rose Hill Meadows. Our security provider will be reassessed, and we are transitioning to a new firm, more aligned with our values and our mission of peace, safety, and compliance." The crowd murmured. Some gasped. Others looked straight at Carlos in disbelief. But before the moment could hang too long in silence, Marcus stepped forward, wearing a blazer and holding a printed folder. "Excuse me," he said loudly enough to silence the crowd. Since Mrs. Albridge likes public announcements, perhaps, the community would also like to know that she has been illegally filming residents without consent. "We have evidence." The entire lawn froze. Karen's smile vanished like smoke in the wind. Marcus handed copies of the photos and footage to the board members present, and turned to the local reporter who had been taking pictures. "Would you like a story worth publishing?" he asked. The reporter blinked, then nodded slowly. "This footage includes timestamps, shows her installing devices in unauthorized locations, and violates state surveillance laws," Karen shouted. "That's a lie. He's making this up. This is a setup." But Marcus remained calm. "Call the police. Let's file a report together. If you have nothing to hide, Mrs. Albridge, the truth will come out." The next 30 minutes were chaos. The board quickly huddled together, trying to contain the fallout. The reporter snapped a photo of Karen yelling as two residents tried to calm her down. Carlos remained off to the side, saying nothing, his arms folded. By nightfall, the photos had already made it onto the neighborhood group and been forwarded to the HOA's attorney. Karen, sensing the unraveling, locked herself inside her house and refused to answer any calls. The property management company announced a temporary suspension of her HOA privileges until a full investigation could be conducted. But the damage was done. Some residents celebrated. Others were just stunned. Carlos became a reluctant hero overnight. But things only got worse the next day. At 7:03 a.m., a brick was thrown through the window of the HOA office with a note attached to it. The note read, "Keep your mouth shut, or you're next." The handwriting was sloppy, the message crude. Police were called immediately, and Carlos gave them everything: his logs, his body cam footage, even the note and brick now sealed in evidence bags. No prints were found. But this wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a warning. Later that day, the remaining board members held a town hall and announced an interim vote to appoint a temporary HOA president while Karen was under investigation. Angela Thompson, the paralegal, stepped up and was voted in unanimously. First order of business was clear: conduct a full audit of Karen's decisions and financial records from the past 2 years. As she read the prepared statement, several residents applauded. Carlos watched silently, grateful but wary. He knew how Karen operated. She wouldn't just vanish. Not her. He hadn't seen her in 2 days, and that alone worried him more than all the screaming combined. Marcus wasn't optimistic either. Someone backed her up, helped her install those cameras, helped her draft those fake accusations. She didn't act alone. The pressure built behind the scenes. One of the 2 men who had been Karen's assistants during the mulch incident had quietly resigned from his HOA volunteer post. Another board member, clearly nervous during the meeting, refused to answer direct questions about approving any of Karen's budgets. A deeper rot was being exposed. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about misused funds, forged documents, backroom deals, a woman who had turned her HOA presidency into a dictatorship. Karen's silence was its own statement. Everyone waited for her next move. Carlos, meanwhile, kept working as usual. He continued patrolling, checking locks, walking the paths at night under the dim streetlights. Some residents stopped to shake his hand, others just nodded. He appreciated it, but his eyes remained sharp and his instincts alert. The story was far from over, because that weekend, as the interim board prepared to finalize a subpoena for Karen's HOA expense records, her garage door opened, and Karen stepped out wearing sunglasses, hair tied back, and a folder in her hand. She wasn't broken. She was ready for war. What she did next would shake the entire neighborhood like an earthquake. Karen didn't knock on the clubhouse door. She kicked it open with enough force to send the knob crashing into the drywall and leave a permanent dent. And every person seated inside the small meeting room turned in stunned silence as she marched in, flanked by 2 men in suits and carrying a large accordion folder packed to the brim with papers, contracts, and what she loudly proclaimed were evidence files. The HOA board had just begun their emergency session to initiate the forensic audit Angela had ordered. But Karen had clearly caught wind of it and came prepared to turn the tables. "I will not be railroaded," she hissed, slamming the folder on the table so hard that a few pens rolled off. "I have in my possession full legal documentation proving that every action I've taken in the last 18 months was in accordance with our HOA charter. If you attempt to remove me without due process, you are opening yourselves to personal legal liability." The suits behind her didn't speak, but their very presence intimidated the board enough that to members Janice and Harold Roof to look up from their laptops. Angela, however, didn't blink. "We are within our rights," she said, calmly. "We have cause, we have complaints, and we have verified evidence of misconduct. You installed surveillance cameras without board approval." Karen laughed bitterly. "I did what was necessary to protect this community when no one else would. If I bent a few rules, it was for the greater good. That's called leadership." Carlos, seated quietly in the back corner of the room as security support, remained expressionless, though inside he could feel the storm building. Karen wasn't here to make peace. She was here to fight back with everything she had. The folder she brought included selectively edited emails, misinterpreted budget line items, and handwritten notes she tried to present as signed authorization forms. She even presented a doctored financial spreadsheet suggesting Carlos had received 2 payments for a single month of security services, something that, if true, could mean he committed fraud. Carlos stood up. "That's false," he said firmly. "I've never received more than 1 paycheck. That document is fake." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Prove it." Angela slammed her gavel down. "Enough. This isn't a courtroom, Karen. You are suspended pending investigation." "That hasn't changed." Karen pointed at Carlos. "You're protecting him. It's all of you are. You're complicit. You're paranoid." Angela snapped back, standing now. "And your intimidation. Tactics don't work here anymore." But Karen wasn't done. She pulled out her final card and, unsigned, letter supposedly written by a concerned female resident who claimed Carlos followed her home one night and lingered in front of her property with his headlights off. The letter was anonymous, typed with no address or date. "This came to my mailbox last week," she claimed. "I didn't write it. Oh, it was mailed to me." If this board ignores it, you are ignoring a potential danger to a resident's safety. Everyone in the room stared at her, some with disbelief, others with unease. Carlos immediately responded, "I've never followed anyone. If someone believes I did, they can come speak to me directly. I have full GPS logs of my patrol routes." He pulled out his phone and opened a secure patrol tracking app, showing minute-by-minute movement logs that proved he was never on the street. Listed in the letter, Marcus, seated 2 rows back, nodded. "That letter's a plant," he said. "If necessary, we'll have it analyzed for fingerprints and print source. But I'd bet a paycheck it came from the same printer that made those fake expense sheets." Karen turned her glare toward him. "You're not even a resident. Stay out of this." "I'm a licensed investigator," Marcus said smoothly. "And the things I've found, you're going to need a lot more than 2 suits to dig your way out." Karen stood there, breathing heavily, unable to pivot. Her play had failed again, and this time it had failed in front of too many witnesses. She turned without a word and stormed out of the room, the 2 men trailing behind her, leaving behind silence thick enough to choke on. But that wasn't the end. That night, someone broke into the security office. Nothing was stolen but Carlos's. Desk drawers were rifled through, his logbooks ripped out, his printed backup files scattered across the floor. And the CCTV DVR system unplugged in act clearly meant to destroy data. Unfortunately for the perpetrator, Carlos had already stored off-site backups, and motion alerts from his personal cam had captured the intruder's silhouette. Though grainy, the footage was clear enough to show the person was wearing a Rosehill HOA branded windbreaker. The board reviewed it the next morning, horrified. Angela called an emergency vote to revoke Karen's board access permanently and file a restraining order preventing her from entering any common area without written permission. The motion passed unanimously. At the same time, the HOA's attorney filed a cease and desist order against Karen and launched a third-party investigation into her alleged misuse of funds. The police were now fully involved and interested in the forgeries and planted documents. Karen had finally gone too far. But she didn't vanish. Instead, she pivoted again. That weekend, she held a community town hall of her own, not in the clubhouse, but in her front yard. She sent out flyers via mailbox and email, inviting anyone who wanted the truth to come hear her side. About 15 residents showed up curious, confused, or loyal to her cause, and found Karen standing at a makeshift podium with printed pamphlets and a slide projector aimed at a white sheet hung from her garage door. She painted herself as the victim, using phrases like "targeted by an agenda," "silenced for exposing flaws," and "betrayed by a corrupt board." She showed images of Carlos, Marcus, and Angela, calling them a triangle of tyranny. She repeated the false accusation about the security patrol payments, even suggesting Carlos might be militia-affiliated, an outrageous and baseless claim that made several residents walk out mid-sentence. Still, a few stayed and nodded. Along, Karen's voice trembled with frustration. "You're tearing this neighborhood apart. I built it up, enforced order when no one else would. And now they're destroying everything I worked for." She ended the meeting with a call to action demanding residents sign a petition to dissolve the current board and reinstate her as interim president until a fair election could be held. By then, the HOA attorney had already obtained a court order halting any formal action she attempted. Karen was now legally barred from representing herself as an HOA official. But she still had one last card in email draft addressed to a local news station. It's filled with half-truths, fake documents, and slanderous claims, ready to paint herself as a whistleblower rather than a disgraced tyrant. She sent it. 2 days later, Channel 12 News ran a 30-second teaser. Local HOA scandal, a president ousted, a guard accused, and a community in chaos tonight at 6. Carlos felt sick when he saw it. The story had reached the media after all, but not the way he'd hoped. He contacted the station and offered a full interview, bringing Marcus and Angela along, but the reporter seemed more interested in the sensational headline than the truth. The segment ran, focusing mostly on Karen's claims and briefly noting the ongoing investigation. No mention of forged documents, no mention of vandalism or illegal cameras, just Carlos's face blurred on screen and a voiceover saying, allegations remain unconfirmed. The damage was done. He was being smeared. Still, he didn't give up. He filed an official defamation complaint. Marcus compiled a full dossier and turned it over to the police. Angela sent a community-wide letter clarifying the investigation's findings to date. Residents rallied again, creating a petition not only to ban Karen permanently from board involvement, but to request the city investigate the HOA's operations for potential fraud and abuse. Karen had gone from queen to pariah, but she wasn't going down without a final explosion. Carlos, exhausted but standing tall, knew exactly what kind of storm was coming next. The only question left was whether the HOA would survive it. The storm finally broke 2 weeks later, not with a headline, a police report, or a town hall fight, but with a series of arrests, legal documents, and a public confrontation so explosive it left the entire community shaken to its foundation. Rose Hill Meadows woke up that morning to the blare of sirens and the buzz of a news helicopter circling overhead. Its camera zoomed in on a black SUV being towed out of Karen Albridge's driveway, while officers combed through her garage with flashlights and evidence bags. It turned out Marcus's quiet investigation, combined with the HOA attorney's audit and Angela's subpoena, had unearthed more than expected multiple falsified invoices under the HOA budget system, diverted funds to a fake landscaping company that didn't exist, and nearly $37,000 paid out over the course of 18 months with Karen's name signed on every single authorization form. She'd been using the HOA funds like her personal piggy bank, and the fake business was registered under a shell name that matched her cousin's address in another state. When police finally moved in, they executed a warrant not just for fraud and misappropriation, but also for evidence tampering and filing false reports, because the surveillance cameras she had installed had footage on them that she never turned over to police during her original complaint against Carlos. She had deleted several clips before hiding the SD cards. What she didn't know was that Marcus had already recovered the original footage from the camera's internal cache before turning them in, and those files showed her plotting with one of her fake security volunteers about how to frame Carlos during the community cleanup event. It was damning, and she knew it, but still, she didn't go quietly. As officers walked her out in handcuffs, neighbors watched from behind curtains and doorways, cell phones capturing every step, some in shock, others with visible relief on their faces. But Karen kept her head high, muttering that this was all part of a smear campaign, that the real criminals were still inside the HOA. And that truth would come out in the trial. She refused to speak to reporters, refused to make eye contact with Carlos, and refused to acknowledge the sheer weight of her fall. By noon, the video of her arrest had gone viral across local HOA forums, spreading into regional news channels. The board released an official statement condemning her actions and reaffirming their full support for Carlos. Angela called a community meeting that night, this time attended by nearly the entire neighborhood. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, with families who had once feared speaking out, now feeling safe enough to raise their hands and share their own stories, tales of Karen, threatening fines for imagined violations. Stories of late-night calls demanding compliance, even a few accounts of her entering backyards without permission. Carlos stood off to the side as these residents gave voice to what had been silently suffered for far too long. Angela spoke next, revealing the full extent of the financial damage Karen had caused, and then did something no one expected. She asked Carlos to come forward. At first he hesitated, but then slowly stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat. "I didn't come here to fight anyone," he said simply. "I took this job to keep people safe, to protect this community. I never thought I'd have to protect it from the very person in charge. But I'm grateful for those of you who stood up, who spoke the truth when it counted." The crowd erupted in applause, a genuine one this time, not out of formality, but out of gratitude. Later that night, as Carlos walked the quiet streets under dim porch lights, he saw hand-painted signs on a few lawns that read, "Thank you, Carlos, and we stand with our guard." It made the long nights, the false accusations, and the character smears feel just a little lighter. But the fallout wasn't over. The following days, the HOA underwent a total overhaul. A third-party audit group was hired. The bylaws were updated to prevent future abuse of power, and residents voted to limit presidential terms and expand board member seats to include community liaisons. Carlos was officially offered a permanent community security coordinator position with added benefits and extended authority approved by the board, not for more power, but for accountability and safety. Marcus returned home, but not before being offered a consulting retainer by Angela. In case anything else surfaced, Karen, meanwhile, was denied bail due to flight risk and tampering charges. Her court date was set, and it was expected to draw press attention. Several of her supporters had quietly vanished, and those who remained refused to comment publicly. But the biggest twist came 3 weeks later when Carlos received an envelope from the city attorney's office. Inside was a formal commendation from the mayor, acknowledging his professionalism, restraint, and service in exposing corruption inside a private organization. The commendation came with a handwritten note. "You weren't just a security guard. You were the safeguard this community needed." The words meant more than Carlos could express. He framed it and hung it in the security office next to a photo of the day he was nearly fired for doing his job. The day Karen lost control was the day Rose Hill Meadows began to heal. But there was one last detail that no one knew. Karen had kept a backup USB drive hidden in a hollowed-out book. And on it were dozens of private emails, secret vote counts, and shady communications with vendors, city contractors, and even one member of the old board who had quietly resigned just before the audit. That USB was found during a second sweep of her home, and the investigation was still unfolding. Rose Hill Meadows would never be the same, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes a place needs to break before it can rebuild the right way. If you've ever dealt with a Karen in power, if you've ever watched someone misuse authority to control others, know this: people can fight back. It takes evidence, unity, and people like Carlos who don't give up when it gets ugly. Thank you for staying through the whole story. If you enjoyed it and want more real neighborhood drama and justice like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the next HOA Karen takedown might be even crazier.